I think it's fair to say that the films of Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huillet can be quite difficult for the uninitiated. They don't look like normal films, they don't sound like normal films. All around, they just don't feel like normal films. But why is that? What is it about the cinematography, the sound design, the acting, the editing that makes these films so inaccessible to general audiences? In this video, I'd like to try answering that question, and in the process hopefully give you all some tools that may help you approach this daunting filmography. And I'm going to do this by talking about adaptations, because it's important to note that every single one of Straub and Huillet's films is an adaptation of some kind, whether that's of a play, a novel, a poem, or even a painting. And in my opinion, one of the main reasons why these films can feel so strange is because of Straub and Huillet's unconventional approach to adapting source material. So the key to penetrating these films' austere exterior is in understanding how Straub and Huillet adapt these texts and why they adapt them the way they do. I think that a good first step would be to identify what the experience of watching a Straub-Huillet film actually feels like. If they don't feel like conventional films, then what do they feel like? And one of the best descriptions of their work I've heard, and probably a good place to start this discussion, is that their films, rather than feeling like the generic kind of literary adaptation we're so accustomed to, instead feel like documentaries about actors performing an adaptation. Generally, movie adaptations of, say, novels or plays will attempt to recreate the world of the source material, the diegesis, through sets, costumes, special effects if necessary, all those things that allow you to suspend your disbelief and become immersed in that fictional world. This all sounds rather obvious, but the reason Straub and Huillet's adaptations feel like documentaries is because there's always an underlying disconnect of some kind, something that's stopping the viewer from being completely absorbed into the world of the source material. In fact, oftentimes that world simply isn't there. And what I mean by this is that Straub and Huillet will essentially carve out the diegesis of the fictional world they're adapting, leaving only actors performing a text in a world that is not the fictional world of the characters, but rather our own world, the real world. Their 1970 adaptation of Corneille's classic tragedy Auton is probably the most famous example of this. While the actors are in period-appropriate costume, rather than recreating the ancient Roman world in which the drama plays out, Straub and Huillet simply drop the actors into contemporary Rome, present-day Roman ruins, in fact, with traffic and the noise of modernity constantly lingering in the background. There is no attempt to cover up the modern world in order to establish an illusory portrayal of the ancient setting. Instead, the explicit appearance of the modern world allows for a new understanding of this classic text.
La beauté de l'objet, la honte de changer, le succès incertain, l'infaillible danger, tout fait à tes projets, d'invincibles obstacles.
However, not all of Straub and Huillet's adaptations are so alienating. They do exist on a spectrum. Some are slightly more conventional, slightly more open to indulging in that illusory recreation of the fictional diegesis, while others feature actors literally just reading a text in front of them. The latter cases result in what we might call a kind of cinematic palimpsest. A pre-existing text is superimposed onto a filmed reality, a documentary image, a mountain, a forest, a field, a city. These locations become home to the words of Hölderlin, Pavese, Kafka, resulting in a layered image. Fellow filmmaker Luc Moulet once commented on this aspect of Straub and Huillet's films, saying, "Their film that amazed me the most was their adaptation of Auton. This film contains several superimposed layers that I would qualify as horizontal and seemingly in contradiction with one another. The first layer is the one based on the text of Corneille's 1664 tragedy, very classical, coherent, and political, filmed without any cuts. The second layer, the one resulting from how the text is treated, The principle was to convey in 90 minutes a play that is performed in 2 hours and 15 minutes. The result is far too dense, too fast for contemporary viewers like myself who cannot manage to understand the meaning of the dialogue, especially since most people, even if they know Corneille's Le Cid, have never read or seen Auton. And Straub's audience is particularly sensitive to the verse, much more so than to the meaning, a kind of music that Corneille may not have wanted, and that enriches the text. The third layer is the one imposed by the setting, Rome in 1969, with monuments that are sometimes in ruins and the rumbling of cars. This provides a judgment on the course of history. This is how the famous Roman Empire has ended up. The fourth layer rests on the costumes from 68 AD. The presence of cars would normally suggest the modern clothing that has more or less become common practice in adaptations of Racine's Britannicus and Berenice, and which should have been necessary in what is clearly a very cheap production. But the period costumes offer the advantage of further underlining the past-present dialectic. The fifth layer is the choice of actors, who speak in a manner that is not neutral and is neither classical French nor Latin. There is an explosive mix of American, Argentinian, German, and modern Roman accents, additional distance, an atemporal universalization, and a new dialectical value in this absurd confrontation. It is hard to go further than the Straubs in this accumulation of superimposed layers. Now that we have an idea of how Straub and Huillet go about adapting source material, we need to answer the question, why? Why do they employ such techniques that dissolve the diegesis of the fictional world, setting a pre-existing text against the backdrop of the real world? And to answer this question, it's impossible to ignore the influence of Bertolt Brecht, whose concept of the distancing effect is central to Straub and Huillet's cinema. Brecht employed a variety of techniques in his epic theatre that sought to break down audience identification with the drama and the characters. For Brecht, an audience that is emotionally invested in the illusion of theatre is an audience that is not thinking. It is a passive rather than an active, critical audience. Martin Esslin writes in his study of Brecht that the audience, in his view, should not be made to feel emotions. It should be made to think. But identification with the characters of the play makes thinking almost impossible. The audience whose souls have crept into that of the hero will see the action entirely from his point of view, and as they are breathlessly following a course of events which, in suspension of disbelief, they accept as really happening before their very eyes, they have neither the time nor the detachment to sit back and reflect in a truly critical spirit on the social and moral implications of the play. One of the most well-known Brechtian devices is the peculiar acting style, which often emphasizes unnatural speech patterns, pronounced physical gestures, and of course fourth wall breaks, and we can certainly see these techniques carry over into Straub and Huillet's films. In reference to his 1965 film Not Reconciled, Jean-Marie Straub once stated that he didn't ask the actors to perform their text in any particular way, but to recite it, like a very precise score. And in Richard Roud's book examining the couple's filmography in great detail, the author writes about the materiality of language in these films. In Auton, Straub is once more treating language as an object, something to be manipulated and handled as freely in the composition of the soundtrack as the visuals are in the cutting room. We are not used to such a procedure. However audacious a director may be in the editing of a film, the dialogue is generally the one thing he doesn't play around with. But Straub treats language cavalierly. Often, as in Auton's speeches, words become simply so many notes in a rhythmic pattern, and one understands not from the words, but from the cadences and the rhythm.
Cet indigne soupçon serait bientôt détruit si vous voyez du crime où doit aller les fruits. Autant que pour Plotine au fond du cœur soupire, autant qui me dédaigne moins que de l'Empire. S'il en fait sa conquête et vous peut détrôner, laquelle dénudée voudra-t-il couronner? Pourrais-je de Pison conspirer la ruine qui m'arrachant du trône y porterait Plotine? Croyez mes intérêts si vous doutez de moi, et sur de tels garants assurés de ma foi, tournez sur Vinius toute, et la défiance n'en veut ternir ma gloire une injuste croyance.
And one of the effects of this estrangement of the language itself, this treatment of the dialogue as a material in its own right, is that the viewer no longer sees a character in a fictional world, but an actor portraying a character, an actor delivering lines. In these films, the, let's say, reality of the actor is retrieved from within the diegesis. And this goes along with something Walter Benjamin wrote, which is that the first commandment of epic theatre is that the one who shows, that is, the actor, shall be shown. And this is one of the true pleasures of experiencing a Straub film, when the viewer realizes that the filmmakers are emphasizing the primacy of the actors over the text, the reality of those human beings who appear on screen and are not reducible to the characters they are portraying. In fact, what is being captured on film is precisely the conflict that inevitably occurs between the actor and the text, between the actor and the world around them. This conflict is not hidden, not concealed. It becomes the focus of the film. Talking against the practice of dubbing films and extolling the virtues of direct sound, Jean-Marie Straub once explained that autant depends entirely on things that cannot be reproduced, the incarnation of Corneille's language in each character at every moment. And he would go on to say that the spoken texts, the words, are here no more important than the very different rhythms and tempi of the actors, and their accents, no more important than their singular voices captured in the moment of their struggle against noise, air, space, sun, and wind, no more important than the sighs they involuntarily emit, or than other tiny surprises of life that are recorded with them, such as single sounds that suddenly take on meanings, no more important than the exertion, the work that the actors do, and the risk that they run like tightrope walkers or sleepwalkers from one end of a long, difficult fragment of text to the other. No more important than the frame in which the actors are imprisoned, or their movements or positions within this frame, or the background before which they are located, or the jumps and changes in light and colour. No more important in any case than the cuts, the changes in the images, the shots. Straub and Huillet's cinema shows how a pre-existing text becomes embodied, or as Straub says, incarnated, in the present moment being filmed by the filmmaker. It's important to remember that this is not just the image, but the sound as well. Straub and Huillet always record direct sound with the image, which results in noticeable jumps between shots, once again emphasizing that each shot is its own block, its own material that is assembled together with every other block to, in the end, produce the complete film. The struggle that Straub mentions between the actor and the sun, the wind, the words of the text, this struggle naturally brings to light a larger struggle that plays out in these films, and that is the struggle between two worlds, the past world of the text and the present world of the performers, the present reality we see captured on screen. And on this topic I would like to quote from Gilberto Perez's book The Material Ghost, which has a chapter dedicated to Straub and Huillet, in which the author writes, "What is past about things from the past? Surely the things are not past, since we encounter them in the present. If they are no longer what they once were, it is not because they are past, but because their world is past, the world to which they once belonged, the whole of which they were part, the context in which they existed. They no longer exist in that context, they are no longer part of that whole, and that context is their past, that whole no longer in place where they once had their place. It is not the parts that are past, it is the whole. What is past about things from the past is a world that no longer is. A film is a piecing together. The pieces may come from different places and different times, but arranged into a whole, they will be seen as parts of that whole, things in the world the film constructs on the screen. The context the film gives them, the whole of which it makes them part, completely takes over. It is not that their world no longer is, it is as if it never was, now that they have their place in the world that comes into being on the screen. Over the documentary details, the things that were there in the world before the camera, the fiction constructed on the screen reigns. But the pieces brought together in a film by Straub and Huillet are not put together in that way. No such fiction is constructed, no such whole that wholly takes over, no such world whose coming into being wipes out what has been. The documentary details captured by Straub and Huillet's camera and microphone are not turned into what is, but remain what has been, retain the mark of their provenance in a world prior to the film. They are things from the past and are to be recognized as such, recognized as pieces that come from different places and different times, different wholes of which they once were part, different worlds that no longer are. Therefore, Straub and Huillet's cinema is fundamentally one of respect for the reality of the beings it illuminates, whereas a conventional adaptation asks us to accept the filmed reality's illusionistic displacement into a diegesis, the suspension of disbelief. Straub and Huillet's films do no such thing. They restore the materials to their rightful place. One of the key notions in 20th century art theory is medium specificity, the idea that a great work of art is one that makes use of those features unique to the given medium. Certain filmmakers concerned with finding the specific modes of expression unique to cinema sought to distance themselves from previous literary forms like the novel and theatre, but Straub and Huillet refused this refusal. The irony here is that it is precisely by insisting upon pre-existing texts, pre-existing art forms, be it theatre or poetry or even opera, that Straub and Huillet are able to reveal the new dimensions of this art form, cinema. Straub and Huillet's adaptations are not translations. Rather, they show what happens to the text when it breaks away from its original world and finds itself incarnated in the present. This is the process that the filmmakers capture on film, and this process is both a retrieval and a rebirth of the past in the present.